Alright, let's talk about inflammation because I think most people have this term rattling around in their head without really knowing what to do with it. You hear it linked to joint pain, to gut issues, to skin flare-ups, even to how tired you feel some days, for no clear reason. And what I want to do today is walk you through 5 foods that actually have real research behind them for calming that response down. Not vague wellness advice. Actual foods, actual mechanisms, actual amounts you'd need to eat to see something shift. Inflammation itself isn't the villain here, and I want to be upfront about that before we go further. It's your immune system doing its job, flooding an area with resources to deal with an injury or an infection. Cut your finger, and the redness and swelling that shows up around it is inflammation working correctly, doing exactly what it's supposed to do, then packing up and leaving once the job is done. That's called acute inflammation, and it's short-lived and useful. The problem shows up with a different version of this, usually called chronic, low-grade inflammation. This is the kind that doesn't announce itself the way a swollen ankle does. It runs quietly in the background, doesn't fully switch off, and over time starts treating your own tissue like it's the threat that needs a response. That version is the one tied to a long list of things people struggle with, from fatigue to joint discomfort to a higher long-term risk of several chronic diseases, and it's the one we're going to target today. There are 5 foods on this list, and I'm going to go through each one the same way: what it is, why it works, and roughly how much of it you'd actually need to eat for it to matter. Because I think a lot of nutrition content stops at eat more vegetables and never tells you the part that actually helps you act on it, which is the amount. Knowing that something is good for you and knowing how much of it you'd actually need are 2 completely different pieces of information, and most people only ever get the first one. So let's start with food number 1, fatty fish. Salmon, sardines, mackerel, anchovies, that whole category of oily, cold water fish. The reason fatty fish keeps coming up in this conversation is omega-3 fatty acids, specifically 2 types called EPA and DHA. Your body doesn't produce these on its own in any meaningful amount, so you're relying entirely on diet to get them in. And what researchers have found, going back decades now, is that populations who eat a lot of fatty fish tend to show measurably lower levels of inflammatory markers in their blood. One of the most commonly studied markers is something called C-reactive protein, or CRP, which rises when your body is in an inflammatory state. Diets higher in omega-3s are consistently associated with lower CRP. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. Most research pointing to a meaningful anti-inflammatory effect lands somewhere around 2 servings of fatty fish a week. Not 2 servings a day, not some extreme intake. 2 servings, roughly the size of a deck of cards each, a couple times a week. That's genuinely attainable for most people, even if you're not someone who thinks of yourself as a fish person. So why does it actually work at the level of your cells? This is where it gets interesting. Omega-3s get built directly into the membranes of your cells, and from there, your body uses them to produce a different family of signaling molecules than the ones it makes from other fats. Picture your cells constantly sending out chemical messages, some of which say, ramp up the inflammatory response, and others which say, wind it down, we're done here. Omega-3s shift the raw material your body has available to make more of those wind it down messages. It's not that they block inflammation outright, they change the ratio of signals your body is even capable of sending. Think about it like this. If your kitchen only stocks ingredients for spicy food, that's all you're going to cook. Omega-3s are like stocking your kitchen with the ingredients for something calmer, so your body actually has the option to make that instead. One extra detail worth knowing here, since it comes up whenever someone asks about substitutes: plant-based omega-3s, the kind found in flaxseed or walnuts, come in a different form called ALA, and your body has to convert ALA into EPA and DHA before it can use it the same way. That conversion process is fairly inefficient, usually somewhere in the low single digits as a percentage. So while flaxseed and walnuts are good foods for plenty of other reasons, they're not a one-to-one swap for the effect we're describing with fatty fish. If fish genuinely isn't an option for you, An algae-based omega-3 supplement is the closest match, since algae is actually where fish get their omega-3s from in the first place. Now, food number 2 on this list, and it's one that gets talked about constantly, but rarely gets explained properly: turmeric, and specifically the compound inside it called curcumin. Turmeric has been used in cooking and in traditional medicine for thousands of years, and modern research has spent the last couple of decades trying to figure out whether the hype matches the biology. What they've found is that curcumin directly interferes with a molecule in your body called NF-kappa B. I know that sounds like alphabet soup, so let me put it in plain terms. NF-kappa B is basically a switch inside your cells that, when flipped on, tells your body to start producing a whole cascade of inflammatory chemicals. Curcumin appears to interfere with that switch being flipped, which means fewer of those inflammatory signals get sent out in the first place. Here's the catch, and it's a big one. Curcumin on its own is poorly absorbed by your body. You could eat turmeric all day and barely raise your blood levels of the active compound at all because your gut just doesn't take it up efficiently. This is the part that trips most people up, and it's also the part almost nobody explains when they tell you to add more turmeric to your diet. The fix is almost stupidly simple. Black pepper contains a compound called piperine, and piperine has been shown to increase curcumin absorption by a wide margin when the two are eaten together. So the practical version of this is turmeric with a real crack of black pepper, ideally with some fat in the meal too, since curcumin is fat-soluble and gets absorbed better alongside oil or fat. That's genuinely it. Turmeric, black pepper, a bit of fat, and you've gone from barely absorbing any of the active compound to actually getting a usable dose. Golden milk, a curry with real black pepper in it, even turmeric roasted vegetables with olive oil, all of that checks the box. And that's honestly one of my favorite things about digging into this topic because it's such a small adjustment and most people have never once been told about it. You could have been adding turmeric to your smoothies for a year and getting almost none of the benefit just because pepper wasn't in the mix. If this is landing for you and you're the kind of person who likes catching these small, high-leverage details before they show up somewhere else, that's exactly the kind of thing I dig into on this channel, so it's worth sticking around and subscribing if you haven't already because there's more of this coming. There's also a supplement version of this worth mentioning briefly, since a lot of people ask about it once they hear turmeric is hard to absorb. Curcumin supplements often come formulated with piperine already built in, sometimes labeled as a bioavailability enhancer, or formulated with a lipid carrier for the same reason we just discussed with fat. Those aren't necessary if you're getting the combination through food, but they're a reasonable option if turmeric isn't something you cook with regularly. Just worth knowing what you're looking for on a label instead of grabbing whatever's cheapest. All right, let's keep moving because we've still got 3 more foods to get through, and honestly, some of the most interesting research is still ahead of us. Food number 3, leafy greens, spinach, kale, Swiss chard, collards, that whole family. Leafy greens do a few things at once, which is part of why they show up on almost every list like this. First, they're a major source of antioxidants, particularly vitamin C and vitamin E, both of which help neutralize something called free radicals. Free radicals are unstable molecules produced as a byproduct of normal metabolism, and in excess they cause oxidative stress, which is closely linked to and often feeds into inflammation. Fewer free radicals running around damaging your cells generally means less signal for your immune system to respond to in the first place. Second, and this part gets less attention than it should, leafy greens are loaded with fiber, and fiber is food for your gut bacteria. When those bacteria break fiber down, they produce short-chain fatty acids, things like butyrate, propionate, and acetate. These compounds get absorbed into your bloodstream and have a direct calming effect on immune activity throughout your body, so you're not just getting antioxidants from a plate of greens. You're feeding an entire ecosystem in your gut that produces its own anti-inflammatory compounds as a byproduct. What does an actual useful amount look like here? Most of the research pointing to meaningful benefit lands around 1 to 2 cups of cooked leafy greens a day, or a somewhat larger volume if you're eating them raw, since they cook down so much. That's a side salad and a cooked vegetable at dinner. It's not an intimidating quantity once you see it broken down that way. Let's pause on that gut piece for a second, because I don't think people appreciate how much of this inflammation conversation actually starts in your digestive tract rather than somewhere more obvious like your joints or your skin. Your gut lining is essentially a barrier, and when that barrier gets compromised, sometimes called increased intestinal permeability, particles that should stay contained in your gut leak into your bloodstream and trigger an immune response. A well-fed population of gut bacteria helps keep that barrier strong. So leafy greens end up working on two fronts simultaneously, feeding the bacteria that protect your gut lining, while also supplying antioxidants that reduce oxidative stress everywhere else in your body. One practical note before we move on, since it changes how you should actually cook these, some antioxidants in leafy greens hold up fine to cooking and in some cases become more available once cooked, since heat breaks down the plant's cell walls and releases compounds that would otherwise stay locked inside. But vitamin C is more heat sensitive and degrades with prolonged cooking, so a mix of some raw and some lightly cooked greens through the week probably covers you better than committing entirely to one method or the other. Steaming lightly or a quick sauté preserves more than boiling does, since boiling lets a lot of the water-soluble vitamins leach directly into the cooking water. Now, food number 4, and this one might surprise you if you've mostly heard it discussed in the context of dessert. Berries. Blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, the whole group. Berries get their deep color from a class of compounds called anthocyanins, and anthocyanins have been studied fairly extensively for their effect on immune signaling. What researchers have consistently found is that regular berry consumption is associated with lower levels of several inflammatory markers, including CRP again, along with a few others involved in the same signaling pathways we talked about with curcumin. Here's a detail I find genuinely interesting. Some of the research on blueberries specifically has looked at immune cell activity, not just blood markers, and found that regular consumption appears to support the activity of natural killer cells and T cells, which are part of your immune system's actual response team. So there's a bit of a dual effect happening. Anthocyanins seem to help calm the chronic, low-grade inflammatory signaling that's the problem, while at the same time not weakening your immune system's ability to actually respond when it needs to. That's an important distinction, because you don't want something that just blanket suppresses your immune function. You want something that helps your body tell the difference between there's a real threat here and there's nothing here, stand down. For amount, most of the studies showing a measurable effect use somewhere in the range of 1 cup of berries a day. Frozen works just as well as fresh here. And honestly, frozen berries often test out with comparable or even slightly higher antioxidant levels since they're usually frozen at peak ripeness rather than picked early to survive shipping. Darker berries tend to carry more anthocyanins than lighter ones, so blackberries and blueberries generally test higher than strawberries. Though strawberries bring their own strong vitamin C content to the table, which loops back to the antioxidant point we made with leafy greens. This is a good example of why variety across these 5 foods tends to outperform picking one favorite and eating only that, since different foods are covering slightly different parts of the same overall system. Alright, food number 5, and I saved this one for last on purpose, because it ties together almost everything we've already talked about. Extra virgin olive oil. Olive oil is the foundation of the Mediterranean diet, which is probably the single most studied dietary pattern in the world when it comes to chronic inflammation and the diseases linked to it. And within olive oil, there's a specific compound called oleocanthal that's gotten a lot of attention because oleocanthal has been shown to inhibit some of the same inflammatory pathways as certain over-the-counter pain relievers. Not identically, and not as a replacement for medication, but the mechanism has genuine overlap, which is part of why researchers got so interested in it in the first place. There's a detail that separates extra virgin olive oil from regular refined olive oil that matters a lot here. oleocanthal is largely destroyed or significantly reduced during the refining process that regular olive oil goes through. So when we're talking about the anti-inflammatory effect, we're specifically talking about extra virgin cold-pressed olive oil, not the more processed version that shows up in a lot of cheaper products. You can actually taste oleocanthal, which is a fun bit of trivia. That peppery, slightly sharp sensation you sometimes get at the back of your throat when you taste a really high-quality extra virgin olive oil, the one that almost makes you cough a little, that's oleocanthal. It's often used informally as a rough indicator of a more potent oil, though it's not a perfect measure on its own. For amount, research showing meaningful anti-inflammatory benefit generally lands around 2 tablespoons a day, used as your primary cooking and finishing oil rather than as an occasional garnish. That's a real amount, not a token drizzle. Using it to sauté vegetables, finishing a dish with it, dressing a salad with it instead of a bottled dressing, that adds up quickly. One more thing worth flagging on olive oil, since it changes how you should be storing it at home. Oleocanthal and the other polyphenols in olive oil degrade with exposure to light, heat, and air over time. So a bottle sitting next to your stove in direct sunlight for months isn't giving you the same oil that was originally bottled. A dark bottle, kept in a cupboard away from the stove and used within a few months of opening, actually preserves more of what you're paying for than most people realize. So let's step back and put the whole list together, because I think seeing it all at once actually matters. There are 5 foods here. The first is fatty fish, working through omega-3s and shifting your body's signaling molecules toward calming down inflammation rather than escalating it. The second is turmeric, working through curcumin blocking that NF-kappa B switch, with black pepper as the key that actually unlocks your ability to absorb it. The third is leafy greens, working through antioxidants and through feeding the gut bacteria that produce their own anti-inflammatory compounds. The fourth is berries, working through anthocyanins that calm chronic signaling while still supporting your immune system's actual response capability. And the fifth is extra virgin olive oil, working through oleocanthal, which shares mechanisms with certain anti-inflammatory medications. What's interesting is that these 5 foods don't operate in isolation from each other. A meal built around salmon cooked in extra virgin olive oil, served over sautéed greens, with a side salad topped in berries, isn't just 5 separate anti-inflammatory inputs sitting next to each other on a plate. There's some evidence that these compounds interact, that the fat in olive oil helps you absorb fat-soluble compounds from other foods on the plate, similar to what we talked about with curcumin and black pepper. So building meals that stack a few of these together isn't just convenient. It may actually be more effective than eating them at separate times of day. I want to address something that comes up constantly whenever this topic gets discussed, because I think it's worth being honest about it rather than pretending it isn't a real concern. None of these 5 foods are a substitute for medical treatment if you have a diagnosed inflammatory condition, an autoimmune disease, or any condition your doctor is actively managing. What the research supports is that these foods can meaningfully shift your baseline inflammatory markers and potentially reduce the everyday low-grade inflammation that's linked to things like fatigue, joint discomfort, and long-term disease risk. That's genuinely valuable on its own. It's just not the same claim as, this treats a diagnosed condition. And I think being clear about that distinction actually makes the rest of this more trustworthy, not less. Now, there's a practical objection I hear constantly when I talk about lists like this, and I want to deal with it directly instead of just glossing over it. People hear 5 foods, here's exactly how much to eat, and think, there's no way I'm restructuring my entire diet around 5 specific things. And honestly, you don't have to. You don't need to hit all 5 targets on the same day every single day forever. What the research actually reflects is a pattern over time, not a perfect daily checklist. If you're eating fatty fish twice a week, Using olive oil as your primary cooking fat and getting greens or berries into most days, you're already in the range that shows up in the studies with the strongest results. This isn't an all-or-nothing system where missing one food on one day undoes the rest of it. One thing that makes this a lot easier than it sounds is that a few of these foods overlap naturally in the same meals without you having to think about it much. Olive oil goes on almost everything. Berries go into a smoothie or on top of yogurt in about 10 seconds. Leafy greens can go into a soup, a stir-fry, an omelet, places where you're barely tasting them as a separate component. The friction is a lot lower than people assume before they actually try it. Let's talk about something I think gets overlooked in almost every version of this conversation, which is timing and consistency versus intensity. A lot of people, once they hear that a food is anti-inflammatory, want to go all in immediately, eating salmon every single meal for a week, drowning everything in turmeric, and then wondering why they don't feel some dramatic shift after 4 days. That's not really how this works. The research behind these 5 foods is built on sustained intake over weeks and months, not a short, intense burst. Inflammatory markers respond to a pattern your body can rely on, not a spike followed by going back to how you ate before. This actually connects to something else worth mentioning, which is that stress and sleep interact heavily with everything we've just covered. You could be eating a textbook anti-inflammatory diet and still run high inflammatory markers if you're chronically underslept or under constant psychological stress, because both of those independently drive the same inflammatory pathways we've been discussing. Cortisol, your primary stress hormone, has a complicated relationship with inflammation. In short bursts, it actually suppresses inflammatory signaling, but under chronic stress, your cells can become resistant to cortisol's regulating effect, and inflammation ends up running higher as a result. So food is genuinely one lever here, a real and well-supported one, but it's one lever among a few, not the entire machine. Sleep deserves its own quick mention here too, since it's often the piece people are most willing to ignore. Even a single night of significantly shortened sleep has been shown to raise inflammatory markers measurably the next day, and repeated poor sleep compounds that affect over time. So someone eating a genuinely excellent anti-inflammatory diet while consistently getting 5 hours of sleep a night is fighting an uphill battle that food alone can't fully offset. This isn't meant to add another thing to worry about. It's meant to explain why some people eat well and still don't see the shift they expect, and it usually isn't because the food doesn't work. I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier and expand on it, because I think it's one of the more underrated pieces of this whole picture. The gut-food connection isn't limited to leafy greens. All 5 of these foods interact with your gut microbiome in some way, even if the mechanism is different for each one. Omega-3s from fatty fish have been shown to actually increase the diversity of bacterial species in your gut, and higher microbial diversity is consistently linked to lower systemic inflammation. Curcumin, even with its absorption issues, has measurable effects on gut bacteria composition before it ever gets absorbed into your bloodstream, since a portion of it interacts directly with your intestinal lining as it passes through. Fiber from leafy greens feeds bacteria directly, which we already covered. The polyphenols in berries, including but not limited to anthocyanins, are largely metabolized by gut bacteria into smaller compounds that are actually the more bioactive form, meaning your gut bacteria are doing a conversion step that makes the berries more useful, not less. And olive oil's polyphenol content, separate from the oleocanthal we discussed, has been shown to favor the growth of certain beneficial bacterial strains over others. So there's a version of this conversation where the headline isn't really 5 separate foods that fight inflammation. It's closer to 5 different ways of feeding and shaping the same underlying system, your gut microbiome, which then produces a lot of the downstream anti-inflammatory effects itself. That reframing matters, because it explains why combining these foods tends to outperform any single one in isolation. and why consistency over time matters more than any single big meal. Let's talk about a mistake I see people make constantly once they've absorbed all of this information, because knowing the list isn't the same as using it well. The mistake is treating this as an addition problem without ever looking at what else is already on the plate. If you add fatty fish, turmeric, greens, berries, and olive oil into your week, but you're doing it alongside a diet that's still heavy in the foods most strongly linked to driving inflammation up, refined sugar, highly processed seed oils, excessive alcohol, ultra-processed snack foods, you're essentially adding fuel meant to calm a fire while also continuing to pour gasoline on it. The research on all 5 of these foods was largely conducted in the context of an overall dietary pattern, not as isolated add-ons layered onto an otherwise unchanged diet. That doesn't mean you need to overhaul everything overnight. It just means the ceiling on how much these 5 foods can help you is partly determined by what they're being added to. There are, roughly speaking, 3 categories of foods that work against everything we've covered today, and it's worth naming them plainly rather than leaving it vague. The first is added sugar, particularly in the form of sugary drinks, which have been shown to raise inflammatory markers fairly quickly after consumption. The second is refined carbohydrates, the white bread and pastry category, which spike blood sugar sharply and drive a similar inflammatory response over time. And the third is industrial seed oils used heavily in fried and packaged foods, which shift the balance of fatty acids in your body in the opposite direction from what we described with omega-3s earlier. None of this means total elimination is required to see benefit from the 5 foods on today's list. It just means the gap between what you're adding and what you're not changing determines how much of an effect you'll actually notice. I think it's worth closing this out with something a little more encouraging than a warning though, because I don't want this to land as one more thing to feel guilty about. The 5 foods on this list are, for the most part, things people already like. Salmon is one of the most widely enjoyed fish there is. Berries are dessert adjacent and genuinely pleasant to eat. Olive oil makes almost everything taste better, not worse. This isn't a list of foods you have to force yourself to tolerate for the sake of your health. It's much closer to a list of foods that happen to already be enjoyable, that also happen to be doing something useful at a cellular level every time you eat them. That's a much easier thing to build a habit around than something that feels like a chore. If you're looking for a simple way to start without overhauling anything, here's what I'd actually suggest. Swap whatever cooking oil you currently use for extra virgin olive oil, since that's a change you make once, and then it just applies to everything you cook from that point forward. Add a piece of fatty fish into your rotation twice a week in place of something else you'd normally eat. Keep a bag of frozen berries in the freezer so they're sitting there whenever you want something in a smoothie or on top of yogurt. Those 3 changes alone put you solidly into the range the research is describing, and none of them require you to think about food differently at every single meal. If this was useful to you, do me a favor and hit like on this video, drop a comment letting me know which of these 5 foods you're already eating regularly and which one you're going to add in, and subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this one, because there's a lot more of this kind of research worth digging into, and I'll see you in the next video.